If you don't know it, Sam Weber and Dan Winters are taking the stage. We're very excited about this interview. I'm sure you all know them, but maybe you don't know them. So I'm not going to do any kind of biographical, but I just want to show you some images from each. Sam Weber we'll start with. This is the cover he did for American Illustration. And then he has, I'm just showing some of their winning images in the current volumes to give you an idea of who they are. Sam Weber's Hammer. Sam Weber's Lolita cover. Photos by Dan Winters, celebrated photographer and, as we're going to find out, an illustrator as well. A few samples, and Dan's going to show some more of his work through the interview. Okay. Sam, I'll let you have it.
Great. It's nice to meet you, Dan.
It is likewise.
We had a very quick, brief meeting just at the stairs there.
3 minutes.
Yeah,
beforehand.
super weird.
Yeah.
But as Mark alluded to, one of the things I think that makes you so relevant to this venue and such an interesting individual is the photography you do in relationship to the illustration that you make. And I'm not sure, Mark, can we show some of the images? Or
Yeah.
does Dan have the clicker?
Yes. Let me just get you set up to click.
Just to give some people some context, because obviously the photos are ubiquitous, and many of them I was familiar with. And the illustration work, some of it I'd seen, especially in Wired and places like that, but
Right.
It never occurred to me that they were done by the same individual, which is fascinating.
Well, you know, I've done portraits for years, and it was one of those things that was sort of a good staple bread and butter. But you know, I always liked to illustrate. I always liked to draw. I love to build things, so it became kind of a natural extension. So these are all sort of recent and older portraits. And then I guess several years ago what happened was, so here's, illustration starts here, right? So this is a piece of the New Yorker where I was illustrating a fiction story on a altercation on a rooftop by which a maintenance worker falls off the building, right? So illustrating that photographically required, building a rooftop and getting a big airbag and building a 12-foot platform and getting an Olympic diver / stuntman to jump off of it. And it's technically it falls under illustration, right? But it's a photographic process, which I really enjoy. And some of these are the same. This was a assignment to shoot a photo booth for Entertainment Weekly, and I couldn't find one I liked. So I built this one in my shop, life size.
Was that really how the illustration process sort of began, as a dissatisfaction with the things that you had available to you to shoot?
Well, using photography, we're dependent on subject, right? We're dependent on a physical object to point our camera at, right? So extending beyond photography, obviously, is way more liberating, as you know, because, at times, right, you have a blank canvas that way, and you can sort of create whatever you want, and photographically, it's got to be created in front of you for the most part. That's obviously changed quite a bit. But not necessarily as much of a dissatisfaction, sometimes the logistics required that. In this case, yeah, there's a place I live in Austin full time, and there's a chain of ice cream places there that have photo booths in them. So my assistant and I went to the ice cream place, sat down, got ice cream, and then I brought a tape measure and I called out all the measurements for the photo booth, and we just went back and built the thing. And yeah, in this case, certainly it was a dissatisfaction. This was another one where we built this set to illustrate a certain point. It was for IBM, but the idea, the campaign was called Deeper. So the idea that everything was sort of moving into depth and, just from a logistics standpoint, go get a location, have, all that stuff, or, do a one-day build and build this thing. So it's pragmatic at times, to do it, to work this way with photography.
So on a project like this, when you're being asked to, I guess, essentially illustrate something as abstract as the concept of going deeper, I'm assuming that was what they were after, sort of a conceptual take on that. Are you concepting these images yourself? Are you working in conjunction with a creative director?
This stuff I concepted all myself. There are definitely major collaborations that I do as well. The deeper thing, I just kept drawing. I did tons of sketches, and
So
then
you're actually drawing on paper to come up with ideas?
yeah,
What you mean
absolutely.
by sketches?
Yeah, in fact, that's how some of the the pencil. Well, we're not there yet, but yeah. For example, this was a story for Wired that and Bill Gates wrote this intro. Bill Gates wrote, and I illustrated his piece, and he was talking about a lot of the infrastructure difficulties in bringing many amenities, not amenities, but necessities to third world countries, one of which was water, and he touched on water quite a bit, and something as simple as water requires a huge infrastructure. So the idea was it was a 1-2 punch, sort of the opener was this glass with this kind of mechanical or mechanics in place providing this kind of water, which is, represents to me like purity, et cetera. And then the turn page was, the realization that there's a huge infrastructure that's informing that. So, these were drawings. The drawings looked pretty much identical to this. When I started getting into, this is a story that illustrated the urinary tract, which is, I know, which is always, those are always really interesting ones. But then we get into the drawing stuff. So this was a column that I did for the New York Times for a year called Diagnosis.
I find the transition, by the way, just fascinating because the first piece, the New Yorker image that you showed, was I would almost classify that just as a photograph. Obviously, there was quite a bit of staging and things like that. And
100%.
then as you're moving on to some of the more constructed things, the photo booth was sort of an interesting second step. And then by the time you're getting to the water piece and the piece about the urinary tract, they're essentially sculptures that you're photographing.
100%. Yeah, I call them. I just build a sculpture, photograph it,
Yeah.
dismantle it.
Were those sort of displayed in any kind of reasonable chronological order? Was that sort of how it happened, photography slowly moving towards illustration, or were they kind of done at a different time?
Well,
period?
it's interesting because a lot of the photography, like the Helen Mirren, for example, so I would call that, photographic illustration to a degree because we're building that environment and then controlling all the aspects of the shoot to achieve sort of a picture that's been storyboarded. The other portraits are much more fluid and organic. They take place on set. There's not really a preconception of it. I think the building, which led to sort of the physical illustration, was a byproduct of dissatisfaction, like we talked about, with locations that were available within, a 20-minute circle of Hollywood for 2 hours, when you're shooting portraits, right? So start building environments that are very much sort of illustrative environments, and then that parlayed itself into kind of just creating like worlds and, solving problems. I've talked to a lot of the people I work for, and they say, we get something in our hands that we have no idea what to do with, and can you make something of this kind of thing? So,
I imagine in a lot of ways that's what a creative director and art director is kind of coming to you
period.
for, right?
Yeah, period. Yeah, I would say for sure. So these are pencil drawings, and like I said, those were for the New Yorker. This was kind of an early one for me that sort of shifted me into works on paper type illustrations. This is a story for Discover, and it was on gravity, and these were basically refined versions of tight sketches that I sent her. So oftentimes I'll do a really tight sketch and say, I'm going to build this. And that was intended on being a construction piece. And the director of photography at the time, Maisie Todd, said, hey, can you just draw the drawings you sent me better? And we'll just do drawings. And that was kind of an early shift,
Are you at liberty in instances to basically sort of provide any solution that you're comfortable with, or do you feel that people come to you looking for a photograph, looking for a drawing, looking for a construction?
Yeah, I'll discuss that in advance. And I do feel like because the website has so many versions of so many things, it's been a gift really to have that, because we can go to a certain section and say, we really like something along these lines. And then, of course, I can take that and interpret it, and say, okay, we're going to do a pencil drawing. I have a general idea of, what that looks like, because it's materials dependent, once again,
Do you feel that having a diverse body of work like that has ever worked against you? Because that's something I hear a lot about, especially from young artists, people who are just getting their careers started. They seem overly concerned almost with showcasing too many different ways of working for fear of scaring people away or making people nervous.
Yeah, I think that's a result of presentation. I tell students oftentimes if there are multiple or myriad ways that you work in, to really make a point when you show it to delineate between those bodies of work. And I think creative directors and the people we work with, photo editors, et cetera, art directors, I think they're more likely to be scared or confused if it's intertwined. Because it seems like oftentimes when I've seen portfolios that are all over the place, they'll have 3 or 4 different ways of working, but they're smattered with throughout one another, that I feel like, if you delineate, this is my portrait section, and maybe there's a pause in the portfolio, and then there's a section of this and a section of that, then I think it's more succinct, and I think the viewer of the portfolio reads it as this person works in several different ways, rather than this person doesn't have a defined vision.
Sure, I guess the fear is that the person themselves does not understand the difference between the things that they make, and
Right,
so I guess as long as you can clarify that to people.
I mean, I'll see portfolios where there's some really bad color pictures in the portfolio, and then the caveat is that, I just wanted to show people I could shoot color.
Yeah.
It's like, well, don't put it in there if it's not, if
Sure,
you're
yeah.
making excuses. I had an instructor one time that said it's either photo credit or photo blame, which I always found amusing, very amusing. So then this stuff is all, the pencil stuff. And this is a pencil drawing I did for Wired just a few months ago, I think. And once again, it was to illustrate a zero emissions coal plant in China. And this, I got schematics of the sort of the system and the way it worked, and then kind of made a more whimsical approach. But, truthfully, these are, I mean, to a degree, like infographics at this point, right? They're kind of like describing a process.
Where does the interest in science come from, Dan? Is that just the type of work that you're being asked to make? Do you have an interest in science?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah, very, very much so. Aerospace, biological sciences specifically. I studied entomology. I raised bees. So I have a very sort of deep interest in biological sciences, and then certainly physical sciences, aerospace, aircraft, et cetera.
Do you mind if I ask when exactly the entomology studies, was that before you became a photographer?
Yeah, so when I turned 9 years old, I joined a 4-H club, which I grew up in an agricultural area in California, so it was very common. And 4-H is primarily based in like agricultural studies, woodworking, small engines, et cetera, veterinary sciences. And entomology became a real passion of mine, and I studied it from the time I was 9 till I was 18, and competed, nationally in the science fair, protective response to the Eliotis beetle, and all this kind of stuff that I did. And I started beekeeping at the same time when I was 9, and so the biological sciences were always very fascinating to me.
I love stories like that, partially because I think it's not fair to do this to everybody, but there's part of me that wants like the narrative of the childhood passion somehow filtering into the the final career at the end. And I know that doesn't always happen, but it's such a great sort of thing to think that the interests of childhood can really be reflected in the work of adulthood.
That's absolutely true. I was just a part of a design conference for Wired in Marin County at Skywalker Ranch, and I spoke on the second day, but I noticed that every speaker, almost without fail, talked about, when I was a kid, I started doing this. And when I got up, I thought, man, we need kids in here, to hear that, because so much of the sort of the passion that's expressed, started early on. And I think when we start early on, we start to really understand our own dialogue, like our internal dialogue. You start to really understand how you think about things, and to be mindful of how we're reacting to things, and understanding sort of what our language is, So yeah, I feel like that's really important.
You are a parent, correct me if I'm wrong?
21-year-old studying aerospace. Shocker. I know, totally. If anybody knows the amount of aerospace stuff I've shot, it didn't fall too far from the tree.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
That's great. Was there there was no pressure to become an artist, I take it? You were supportive of
It's interesting. He's 100%. In fact, he compliments and thanks me often for fostering every interest he had as he grew up, whether it was like learning every flag of every country. We were at the NASA Media Center when I was working on the shuttle launch project, and the Media Center, the entire ceiling is flags hanging vertically from all over the world, and Dylan stood there and he missed one. He just started going like, boom, 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 all the way down the line. And the one he missed, he corrected himself. He's like, oh no, wait, I think that's not the Serbian flag. That's the, whatever it was, I don't know, the Imperial German flag or whatever it was, even like periods, he was good at. So anyway, but his interest in art, actually, he's talented musically, but he's a mathematical mind. And he told me at one point that he didn't like art because art didn't have an answer. And in mathematics, there was an answer. There was a way to solve the problem. And he said, when I'm doing art at school,
There's no answer.
There's no answer. Well, he's doing art at school, and he says it frustrates him because he doesn't know when he's done with it, and that he doesn't know where it's going to go. But I told him, the more you do it, obviously, right, the more you can calculate your results, and you understand where you're going to end up.
In theory, yes.
But isn't that funny? I know in theory, totally right.
That is funny. Well, your kid is really bright by the sounds
He's
of it.
a bright kid, yeah. So, this is some collage / painting stuff I did for Wired. And I think when this stuff's prominently featured, you talk about, magazines that have more of a sort of a presence or an audience, I think the New York Times stuff and the Wired stuff and the New Yorker stuff, they kind of all inform to a degree one another. Those are kind of in the same world.
Sure, yeah, and especially when you're talking about the visual culture of those institutions.
100%,
Those
yeah.
art departments are, I guess Wired is in San Francisco, but it is part of the community, especially here,
Sure.
the publication community. Yeah.
And the one thing, when I was early on in my career, I found really helpful and would highly recommend it to anyone that's looking to sort of change what they're doing or change their venue I would go to magazine stands because I have a passion. I started as a photojournalist, passion for magazines, passion for publications in general, books, et cetera. But to go to a stand and just start rifling through the thousands of, 1,000 magazines
Yeah.
at a newsstand and figure out where you could live.
Yeah.
Rather than square peg and round hole, it's like, my God, my work could be featured in this magazine
Yeah.
with no problem, and then kind of pursuing that rather than, kind of more strategic bombing rather than saturation bombing.
Yeah, and I've noticed a blind spot regarding that exact skill amongst my students, for instance, because they're consuming so much imagery online, and it's completely divorced of any sort of context, so they don't understand that this was in a magazine that is news-based, and this isn't a magazine that's
Sure.
entertainment-based, and so, I don't know, they're clearly getting other things from looking at images online, but it seems like there's a danger, right, to looking at images without any kind of context.
Yeah, the interesting thing about context for me is that if there isn't a context presented with the image, we kind of make up our own story.
Oh,
And, I remember early on seeing the wonderful 1932 Cartier-Bresson photograph behind the Gare Saint-Lazare, where the man is playfully sort of jumping into a puddle, and it's the moment before his heel breaks the surface tension in the water, and being incredibly frustrated, wanting to know like how that was made. How was that made? Was that set up? Did he know the guy? It was so frustrating to me because I was trying to make up a story, and really to save my own frustration, I decided at some point like it didn't really matter. Like it was what it was. And it's a beautiful image. It's compelling. It was never pegged, nor was it involved in any kind of like news. It was a completely like visual image. So I do feel like there is a danger, or not necessarily a danger, but I do feel like when it's a news image and it's telling a certain story, at least the initial usage or usage that is around what that news event is, that it be presented with the image, But just purely as like to appreciate an image singularly, context oftentimes is really not necessary. I think
Yeah.
oftentimes important though.
That's super interesting. I actually, just to bring it back to your work momentarily, when you are making an image, how service oriented are you when you're working on something? Are you trying to create beautiful things to satisfy yourself, or are you?
Yeah.
Do you feel beholden to the client to please them? I say this only because that seems to be a reoccurring discussion between my friends and I about, how much do you please yourself, how much do you please the client, and when push comes to shove, what side of the divide do you fall on?
Well, I came to realize that I had a skill set, like within photography, for example. Like I possessed a skill set that would provide me with opportunities because I possessed that skill set. That skill set's changed over the years, obviously. But, I will say that for the most part, particularly in editorial context, is that I don't get a whole lot of direction, and therefore I feel like the onus falls on me to step up. And so oftentimes, I'm trying to please myself. But I know through that, I know that there's been enough discussion to where the client has an idea of what they're going to get, like some sort of loose idea, especially in illustration, obviously. I mean, I sketched, not this one, but I sketched the previous image fully fleshed out, and I did that because I needed to know what it was going to be. And so there was a complexity to that I sketched out and got approval for it, but there was no guidelines whatsoever about how to execute it. But I do think, in work in general, it's got to be satisfying. Some days less than others,
Of course.
I mean, as an artist, the last thing you want is to like lapse into formula. Although we do have a way of working, we do have a way of seeing things. We're dependent on materials, obviously. It's amazing as a photographer that nothing we use, we make for the most part. Everything is something. So what we're doing is we're taking a bunch of technology that's out there and we're adapting it to sort of our vision or our way of thinking or our way of working. But we're dependent completely on manufacturers. So I know I went kind of way off from
No,
what the question was.
this is great, though. I love this idea of talking about the mechanics and the tools.
Yeah, I mean, even in what you talked about earlier, it's like I'm going to do a pencil drawing of the torso of a woman who's fainted. You know, you have kind of an idea what that could look like, you know, and then I'll do a quick sketch and then go. But I don't think there was any sort of shock when, you know, you turn it in. You talk about what it's going to be in advance. But I do feel like, you know, I intentionally, without fail, every single time, with a few exceptions, I feel like I have to constantly rise to the occasion. And you also know, as a freelancer, you know, you're only as good as your last record, right?
Yeah, sure. Well, does someone like you still think about stuff like that?
100%.
Really?
Every time. Yeah, I really do. And I think you have to. I really think you have to. I think
There's no hope for any of us, you guys.
I had this misconception early on that, like, if I could shoot a Rolling Stone cover, like, everything would be great in my life. And then I shot a Rolling Stone cover, and then the next day I woke up and nothing had changed. And the idea that that was 25 years ago.
Well, that's, I guess, sort of reassuring and also sort of depressing to think that someone with a career like yours still has insecurities.
I don't know that it's an insecurity. It's more of a realization that, you know, ultimately we are able to express our passion through our work, but we have to understand the mechanics of who's paying for it. And the mechanics of who's paying for it is a photo editor or you know, a photo editor or director of photography that gives you the assignment, and they get the thing, right? And then they have to turn around and go to their superiors with that thing. And if that thing falls flat on its face, it's a reflection on their decisions and the decision-making process they're making in which they receive that image, right? So it could be, you know, they don't want to have that conversation over and over, you know? You get a couple get out of jail free cards, you know, and sometimes you get on base. Sometimes doubles, triples, home runs, but, you know, the home runs are elusive. The triples are elusive. But, you know, if we can get a solid double every time and you know, get a good RBI, I suppose,
Oh,
to
boy.
use a baseball analogy.
Can you make a
I
Dungeons
don't
and
even
Dragons
follow,
analogy
I don't
that I
even
would
follow
understand?
sports. I didn't know who won the World Series until after it was over. But I played baseball for years. And I find that those analogies, that specifically baseball, and all badminton as well. There's a lot of good analogies. There are none in badminton that I know of, actually. Other than there's just an amazing sort of banal sort of event going on.
So how much of your success, Dan, do you think is attributed to your personality? Because it sounds like you have a personality that's well suited to being a commercial artist or an artist that works, you know, in collaboration with companies and people.
Well, I think, you know, we talked about reverence on the phone and the idea that we have to have reverence for people that come to us, you know. I never adopt my way or the highway sort of approach to anything, because I understand that there are a lot of decisions that were made specifically in advertising. You know, there may have been 6 months of conversation, many things shot down, many things approved, many people involved, and that entire 6 months and all the effort comes down to me on the day making the picture that they've been talking about for 6 months or whatever. So I am absolutely interested in collaborating and to try to achieve, you know, what they need, right? And still make it mine. And I think at this point in my career, I get hired to do the kind of images that I like to make. So it's not usually a struggle to achieve that. But I have to always consider that and always have gratitude for, you know, even getting the phone call. So I think personality-wise, there's a great quote by Jay Mizell, who's a wonderful, wonderful photographer and a wonderful person. I mean, he said, if you want to become a better photographer, become a more interesting person. And I think there's so much truth to that because, you know, as visual artists, you know, if we're culling our inspiration from our discipline, I feel like we need to go outside of our discipline. And I feel like life is our first sort of venue, right, or avenue for inspiration. And, you know, other visual arts and other arts and medicine and wherever we want to go to bring stuff back into our work.
One of the things that I've always actually sort of struggled with when I've tried to kind of conceptualize what a photographer career even looks like is how you differentiate yourselves from other photographers. Because, like you said, you are using a lot of the same tools and a lot of the same tricks. Is it really just your process and use of those tools that sets you apart? Is there something else? Is it really like what you just said, the life experience? Is that really?
Well, I think a sensibility that you develop, right? So you develop a sensibility. So in photography, obviously, the sensibility is steeped in what's available equipment-wise and what's available from a technical standpoint, and then also sort of what's my voice, you know, and that applies to anything. You know, what's your voice? I mean, if you think about, I was just working with astrophysicist Kip Thorne, who I showed earlier in the slideshow, and we were talking about quantum mechanics, quantum physics. We went for a hike, and we talked about music, and we talked about the few notes and chords that you have that you can use to make music, and I said, I wonder at what point society will run out of options. And he, using a mathematical formula, said very, 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 very long time, because mathematically you can calculate the infinite possibilities of it, even with the small numbers that you have to work with. So, which I found really comforting, actually. But I think it just in terms of setting yourself apart, I really feel like there's a sort of, oftentimes we hear the word style, and style to me, to a degree, is more artifice. It's more surface, right? It's more recognizable quickly, and content maybe is a secondary thing. So you thumb through a magazine and you see an illustration by Marshall Arisman, for example, in the 80s or 90s, right? And you love that thing, and you know who did it, and it almost doesn't matter initially sort of what it's about or what it is. It's a beautiful object, right? And his work was very consistent, so it was always in Marshall Arisman illustration, which I absolutely loved. And Brad Holland, if you think about Matt Mahurin's work. But there's a depth to those individuals as well that is beyond sort of what you would call the style or the approach, et cetera. And I think that depth in the insight and the depth that is imbued within the illustration is what makes it desirable, as well as the aesthetics of it, but the ability to sort of fuse complex thoughts into something that's invariably very simple, or can be very simple. But that's the age-old thing, what's anybody's style? What's Ansel Adams' style? It's like he's shooting Yosemite, right? But there's a reverence for the place that really manifests itself in the image, and also there's a way of working, technical way of working, and then compositional, and I look at works from Ray Metzger, for example, who passed away a couple weeks ago, and I have no idea where that came from when I look at that work. It's so profoundly complex and beautiful and graphic at the same time, heartfelt and soulful. I look at that stuff and it's almost a mystery to me, where that came from. You look at work and you think wow, I got to hang it up. I'm going to sell my cameras.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah. Anyway.
Can we talk quickly about these, because the process is completely different than
yeah, these are
photograms
that initially photograms, and then so basically a sheet of photographic paper put into an easel under a larger, exposed to light, and then soaked in water, and then squeegeed off, and then hand applying chemicals to the paper and making paintings using chemicals and silver, and then fixing it as though you would a normal photograph. So these I did a couple weeks ago, actually, and then the early ones were made years ago. Those were made quite a long time ago. And it's interesting as well, ways of working, when we talk about ways of working. So the idea is, you'll explore something, and oftentimes I won't get disillusioned by it, but maybe I'll feel like I come to a point where I want to move into something else. But you always have that sort of body of work. I think of my work as, I see when I'm shooting, if I'm out on the street with my Rolleiflex doing street photography, I know where that work goes within my body of work. Okay, that's going to go over here. That's part of this body of work. That's part of that.
So you're editing sort of as you're even observing.
As you're doing it. So right now I'm shooting for this body of work or whatever. So these chemical paintings are a part of sort of a big body of work, or that type of work, photograms, chemical paintings, etc. These are Xeroxes. I'm obsessed with Xeroxes. I know all the people at my Kinko's first name basis. There's these identical twins that work there. Amazing, these two guys.
Can you
and
tell
I can
them
never
apart?
tell. It's awesome when they're both working, but I can never tell which one's working at any given time. But this is a cactus branch, and this is I made this grid, and I put it on one of my drills, and I took the drill to Kinko's and sat the grid onto the thing, and then hit the button and fired up the drill. So it spun as it scanned. It was scanned over it, and the great thing about doing that and the photograms, honestly, is there's a very rapid feedback. You're getting the feedback right there.
Yeah.
So you're saying, you're seeing the results of it instantly. And the Xerox stuff especially is just so much fun to do. That's the last image I have, but we can keep talking.
Yeah, well, I think we're actually almost out of time. I have
Okay.
one quick question, a two-parter, which I think you answered the first part already about staying relevant. It sounds like that has not been a problem. My main question, the one that I was sort of the most curious about, is how you've maintained interest in your career for, you said 30 years you've been working. Were there ever moments of burnout, of fatigue with what it is you were doing?
There have been moments of fatigue, obviously. I mean, when I think about the logistics of getting to the point where I'm photographing, so the amount of time that's invested in a 2-hour shoot, you know, flying to Europe to do a shoot, days and days and days, and you're actually exercising your abilities for a very short period of time, 2 hours, an hour, whatever it is, several hours, those can get very tiring because you're not actively like making your art, you know, it's about the logistics become a more part of it. But I would say the only burnout I've ever had has just been physical burnout, where I can't, you know, I need to stop, I need to rest, you know, I keep going. But as far as, you know, discipline goes, constantly, obsessively, shoot every day, you know, I was shooting yesterday, walking around the streets and shooting, and I feel like, you know, my camera that I carry in my pocket that has a phone attached to it, you know, those things.
Those, yeah.
I am so over this thing of like, I shot it on my cell phone. It's like the ability for that phone, for that camera on that phone is far, far greater than the cameras that my parents grew up photographing me with, like a 110 and those 127s and all those. And I feel like people really marginalize it because it's shot on the phone. And I also wanted to address the hipstamatic filter thing, which to me is called like the Super 8 effect. Like you point a Super 8 camera at anything and it looks totally badass. It doesn't make anybody a good photographer. What it does is it takes the image out of the realm of reality and it creates a lure. So we're like compelled to look at it because it's something we can only experience through the photographic process. I told a friend of mine the other day I was going to tape an old phone to my Leica so that when I went out, you know, I had a camera phone rather than a phone camera or whatever, phone camera. I don't know. Anyway, so what was the question again?
Staying interested. I think you answered it.
Yeah, staying interested.
Yeah.
That's never been a problem for me at all. And if it's not, you know, I do this weird like obsessive stuff too. Like you know, I got obsessed with like Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and like watched every movie and read every book and figured out like all these sort of trivia around it. And then I'll get into this and you know, I'm way into model trains. I have a whole train layout up in my studio. And now all I do is watch obsessively European speedway motorcycle racing, like as a way to relax. But I go through these major sort of like, I want to learn everything I can about this thing.
Yeah, are those, would you classify those as hobbies, or are they filtering back into the creative work somehow?
Definitely. It's just an extension, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, I mean, you know, I find sort of the train thing, when I watch my train, I can sit and watch my trains go around their tracks, and there's a real meditative feeling to that. And then also there's the satisfying boyhood. You know, I've consciously bought like exactly the trains with the proper dates and every single thing that I would have seen when I was a kid. So like perfectly matched to like what it should be and stuff like that. So I don't know what that is, but I do feel like all that behavior
What is that?
it all brings it back in. I feel like it brings it back in, you know. No, I don't. They just come to me. I mean, you know, the hobby of like getting up early in the morning and watching a live feed of a Grand Prix Speedway race in Poland I could have never told you that I was going to be doing that. So I'm sure something will present itself. The season just ended. An American actually won the gold. Greg Hancock. He's 44. He's from. My wife's like, okay, that's enough. She's so sick of the Speedway thing, it's not even funny. Anyway. Yeah, I don't feel like I've conquered any of them, but I do feel like I've made strides, right? Because I don't think we ever conquer. I think we can get a sort of a modicum of command over it, right? You know, I've been playing around with painting for a long time and never have had the time nor the sort of instruction I'm kind of figuring it out, which I think one mysterious part of any career also is the idea that you need to know what it needs to look like. And I really do feel like we invent the way we do everything. So like early on, it's like, what does a photographer wear? What is it, you know, you try to think of like, what is that, you know, and the truth is at the end of the day, you just kind of make it up for yourself, I think. Not to say we can't learn from other people's experiences, et cetera, you know. You know, I've shot in New York since I lived here in 1987. I moved here. And, you know, I'm a real traditionalist, so I grew up kind of, you know, with the appreciation of going way back, you know, lighter in the 50s and, you know, Callahan, not so much in New York, but in Chicago and Metzger, like I said, and then, you know, into the 70s with Meyerowitz and Papa George and McDonough and a lot of that sort of really traditional street photography. That's kind of, you know, I say, when you say street photography, I feel like oftentimes people think of like Paris and New York. Those are kind of the meccas for the street photography thing. So there's a lot of different ways I work. You know, I'll work 35 loose and just look for stuff. And then I'll work medium format and stuff is more stayed and more kind of observed and looked at. But it's just black and white 35 and medium format. Handheld stuff, just, you know, portraits, street portraits, also just like great moments, details, et cetera, et cetera.
On the topic of New York, actually, I had a quick follow-up question. What was it that inspired you to leave the city in the first place?
Oh, well, I grew up in California, and I was living in New York, and all along I thought, you know, I'd like to go back to California. My family's all there, et cetera. And I met my beautiful wife here, who's chiding me about Speedway earlier, and she and I met, and we were bi-coastal for a little while. She was living in Hollywood. She was working in the film business, and then kind of made the plunge and went back to New York. So it was kind of a non-event. I thought it might have been sort of a seminal event in that, you know, I thought my career might change, and I had anxiety to a degree about like moving away from where all the publishing is, but it was not an event at all. I feel like if I'd moved to a smaller market, like Austin's a very small market. It's saturated with photographers. At that point, that might have been a problem.
Yeah.
But moving to LA, there's a lot of work in LA and
Sure.
stuff.
And nowadays, I guess it doesn't even really matter, right? The internet and all that.
Yeah, it
sort of makes
doesn't
irrelevant.
really. Yeah, it doesn't really. I think the tools and the approaches will change, but I think, like for example, in the illustration work, you know, I don't think I'm even remotely like in the high field of illustration, like even remotely. And I can't do what Sam can do. There's no way in hell I could do that. But I can do what I can do. And I can take my skills, whatever level my skills are that exist, and I can kind of make images that are, I don't want to say subservient, but sort of are reflective of what my skill set is. And so if I get an assignment to do something, say it's a collage or a drawing or whatever, you know, I can work the way I've kind of established. And I've done it for a long time. I've drawn for a long time. I've done all kinds of artworks on paper for a long time, photography on a long time. So I sort of have an idea in my mind of, you know, what I'm doing and how I'm thinking about things. I think what it comes down to is just, you know, understanding how you think about things. And once that happens, then you can start sort of like, that'll manifest in the work.
Sam and Dan, I'm afraid we have to leave it here.
Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really a thrill having you.
And you can sort of like create whatever you want, and photographically, you know, it's got to be created in front of you for the most part. That's obviously changed quite a bit. But not necessarily as much of a dissatisfaction, you know, sometimes the logistics required that. In this case, yeah, you know, there's a place I live in Austin full time, and there's a chain of ice cream places there that have photo booths in them. So my assistant and I went to the ice cream place, sat down, got ice cream, and then I brought a tape measure and I called out all the measurements for the photo booth, and we just went back and built the thing. And yeah, in this case, certainly it was a dissatisfaction. This was another one where we built this set to illustrate a certain point. It was for IBM, but the idea, you know, the campaign was called Deeper. So the idea that everything was sort of like moving into depth and, you know, just from a logistics standpoint, like, you know, go get a location, you know, all that stuff.
Photos by Dan Winters, celebrated photographer and, as we're going to find out, an illustrator as well. A few samples, and Dan's going to show some more of his work through the interview. Okay. Sam, I'll let you have it.
Great. It's nice to meet you, Dan.
It is likewise.
We had a very quick, brief meeting just at the stairs there.
3 minutes
Yeah,
beforehand.
super weird.
Yeah.
But as Mark alluded to, one of the things I think that makes you so relevant to this venue and such an interesting individual is the photography you do in relationship to the illustration that you make. And I'm not sure, Mark, can we show some of the images? Or
Yeah.
does Dan have the clicker?
Yes. Let me just get...
Illustrating that photographically required, you know, building a rooftop and getting a big airbag and building a 12-foot platform and getting an Olympic diver / stuntman to like jump off of it. And, you know, it's technically, it falls under illustration, right? But it's, you know, a photographic process, which is, you know, which I really enjoy. And some of these are the same. You know, this is This was a assignment to shoot a photo booth for Entertainment Weekly, and I couldn't find one I liked. So I built this one in my shop, life size.
Was that really how the illustration process sort of began, as a dissatisfaction with the things that you had available to you to shoot?
Well, you know, using photography, we're dependent on subject, right? We're dependent on a physical object to point our camera at, right? So extending beyond photography, obviously, is way more liberating, as you know, because, I mean, at times, right, you have a blank canvas that way.
You set up to click.
Just to give some people some context, because obviously the photos are ubiquitous, and many of them I was familiar with. And the illustration work, some of it I'd seen, especially in Wired and places like that, but
Right.
It never occurred to me that they were done by the same individual, which is fascinating.
Well, you know, I've done portraits for years, and it was one of those things that that was sort of a good staple bread and butter. But you know, I always liked to illustrate. I always liked to draw. I love to build things, so it became kind of a natural extension. So these are all sort of recent and older portraits, and then I guess several years ago, what happened was. So here's, illustration starts here, right? So this is a piece of the New Yorker where I was illustrating a fiction story on a altercation on a rooftop by which a maintenance worker falls off the building, right? So
If you don't know it, Sam Weber and Dan Winters are taking the stage. We're very excited about this interview. I'm sure you all know them. But maybe you don't know them. So I'm not going to do any kind of biographical, but I just want to show you some images from each. Sam Weber we'll start with. This is the cover he did for American Illustration. And then he has, I'm just showing some of their winning images in the current volumes to give you an idea of who they are. Sam Weber's Hammer. Sam Weber's Lolita cover.